So now that we finished part 1 of this chapter where we talked about individual differences and the 2 reasons why psychologists believe those differences occur, we now move on to part 2 of chapter 1, which is assessment of psychological attributes. So now that we know that all of us are different, we now want to measure by how much, across what dimensions do we differ from each other, because humans have a knack for comparison. So for example, when you hit puberty, you compare your height with your friends to see who is taller. So I'm a very short person and all my tall friends make a lot of fun of me because of my height. So like we compare our heights, similarly we need to assess psychological attributes to see how much we differ from each other, across what dimensions we differ. Not to make fun, but just to know. So what exactly is assessment? So how do we compare? We first need to assess how much of each psychological attribute we have, the degree to which we have each psychological attribute. So for that we use assessment. So what exactly is assessment? According to the book, it is the step number 1 in understanding any psychological attribute. So let's say, for example, height. Height is not a psychological attribute. I'm just giving an example. So when you want to compare your height with your friends' height, so what do? You first measure each of your heights, and then using a scale you compare who is taller, who is shorter, right? Similarly, for comparing psychological attributes such as intelligence, personality, you need to assess it, right? So it is step number 1 in understanding any psychological attribute. So to understand any psychological attribute, you first need to assess that attribute. So in understanding any psychological attribute, you first need to assess it, right? Second, it is the measurement of psychological attributes of individuals and their evaluation, often using multiple methods in terms of certain standards of comparison. Now you're not only assessing one psychological attribute of everybody, right? You have various psychological attributes. You have intelligence, you have personality, you have values, as we'll study later, right? So you are measuring different psychological attributes, and each psychological attribute has a different way of measuring it, right? You cannot measure, or you cannot understand somebody's personality by giving them an IQ test. That is for understanding their intelligence. Okay, so you measure. What is assessment? It is a measurement of psychological attributes of individuals and their evaluation. What do? How do you do it? You use multiple methods in terms of certain standards of comparison. So I'll give the example of height, and then we'll draw from that. So let's say I am 5 feet, my friend is 5.5 feet. Okay, so how do I know I'm shorter than her? I first measure each of our heights, right? So I come out to be 5 feet, she comes out to be 5.5 feet. And then you compare based on some standard of comparison. When I use an inch tape, we see that 5.5 feet is greater than 5 feet. So that is our standard of comparison. The inch tape, the scale, is our standard of comparison here. So that is how we know that she is taller than me. But now how do we do this for psychological attributes? So we use multiple methods in terms of certain standards of comparison. Now different methods have different standards of comparison. So like we have IQ test. So if you have more than 100 IQ, you are considered a genius. If you have less than 100 IQ, you are considered to have less than average intelligence. So that's the standard of comparison for IQ test. Personality tests will have different standards of comparison. Values will have different standards of comparison, and so on. So if I say that I am dominant, does it automatically mean that I have that trait? So let's say I go about telling everybody how that I have diabetes, for example. So if it is not medically proven, does it mean that I actually have diabetes? No, right? Similarly, for psychological traits, if I say that I have some attribute, it has to be tested. It has to be measured by using scientific procedures. This is another word for using assessment methods that we talked about, right? So that trait will exist only when it can be measured by using scientific procedures. So when it is actually tested using various methods which have certain standards of comparison, and it comes out that I actually have that trait, then only I can say that I have that trait. It can be proven then, right? So now there are 2 ways to do this. How do I assess a psychological attribute, there are two ways to do this. There is a formal method and then there's an informal method. So the formal method, the mnemonic to remember the three parts of formal method are so. So O here stands for objective. What does objective mean? That the test is same for all. Everybody gets the same questions. Everybody has the same time to do those questions. And the questions are, and the answers are interpreted objectively. So there'll be MCQs. So there might be only 1, 2 or multiple correct answers, but everybody has the same answer key. So it cannot be that one assessor thinks this is the right answer, and for the same test another assessor thinks that some other answer is correct, right? So let's say, for example, 2 plus 2 is always equal to 4, no matter which researcher is giving the IQ test, right? So it cannot be that researcher A thinks 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, whereas researcher B thinks 2 plus 2 is equal to 5. That's not possible, right? That is what we mean by objective. Second is standardized. Standardized means, let's say 2 researchers conduct the same test. Let's consider IQ test. So researcher A and researcher B conduct this IQ test on 100 individuals each. So the scores of these 100 people can be compared with the scores of these 100 people because the standard of comparison is the same. The scoring key is the same. The number of points given for each question is the same. So across researchers, across assessors, you can compare the scores of each individual. That is what we mean by standardized. There's a fixed standard of scoring and interpreting those scores. Last is organized. I'm not very sure about this, the definition of organized, but in my opinion, I think that they have a fixed set of questions. Everybody gets the same questions. Yeah. And so psychologists are actually trained in the formal method of assessing. Contrary to this, we have the informal method of comparison, which varies from case to case and from one assessor to another. Now, researcher A might give some questions, researcher B might give some other questions, right? And they are open to subjective interpretation. Now, if somebody wrote some long answer, right? So let's say it's an open-ended question. So researcher A might interpret it in some way, researcher B might interpret it in some other way. So it's open to subjective interpretation. That is what we mean by informal method. But the thing is, why exactly are we doing all of this? Why can't we just simply live without knowing what our psychological attributes are? How much of each do we actually have? So we do this to help us in prediction. So humans don't like unpredictability. We like familiarity. We like being able to predict things. So if, for an example, let's take this one. So if I assess that somebody is a sociopath, I know that they are capable of committing crimes, right? So this is not in the book and it is only for understanding. So please do not write this in your answer sheets. This is just for fun and for understanding as well. So if I can make out that according to the behavior or assessments that psychologists have conducted, that somebody is a sociopath, I will be aware that this person is capable of committing crimes. So the examples given in the book and which are safe to write are these. So when you can see that a student is consistently scoring very less, so what can the teacher do? The teacher can help the weak students by changing his or her teaching methods. Similarly, if a psychologist assesses that an individual is having a very hard time adjusting with the family members, so he or she can conduct personality assessments and then figure out a middle ground so that the family can gel well with the individual, right? So psychological assessment, when you talk about assessment, it uses systematic testing procedures. Systematic means it follows a specific system, rules, regulations. So it uses systematic testing procedures to evaluate 3 things. We have abilities, we have behaviors, and we have personal qualities of individuals. I'll repeat again. What does psychological assessment use? It uses systematic testing procedures to evaluate 3 things: abilities of individuals, behaviors of individuals, and personal qualities of individuals.